for the Susan Taylor Podcast, where we discuss the yoga of mind, medicine, and healing. Author of Feeling Good Matters, Sexual Radiance, and the Vital Energy Program, Dr. Taylor imparts authentic knowledge and practical tools that inspire, educate, and empower us to be a healing force for positive change. So join us and take your life and our planet to the next level.
Hello and welcome to episode 17, Preventing Burnout, the Secret of the Breath. Today we'll talk about the 2 skills needed to rise above the burnout factor. And we'll speak about 3 brain facts to consider when discussing burnout. And I'll suggest a breathing practice for all of you who want to engage in getting started. I really look forward to speaking about these topics, so let's get started. Everyone understands the stress of being alive in today's current climate. In fact, everyone knows that stress does lead eventually to burnout. Many of you have had friends or colleagues that have or are experiencing this kind of stress, and perhaps you yourself are suffering from stress leading to burnout itself. Just not in the mood to go to work or to do anything or get involved with anything because you're just tired and exhausted or frustrated. This podcast is intended to give you the tools to avoid factors that contribute to burnout, and I'll discuss the science that supports the practice that I'm going to share with you today. Let's talk about the 2 skills needed to rise above or avoid the burnout factor. As many of you know, I was certainly privileged to be trained by masters of a 5,000-year-old lineage with the science and the practices that have kept me alive during my years of doctoral training. In fact, we've heard in other podcasts that the science is the precision behind the practices. And just recently, I wrote something based on when we have that knowledge behind why we do the practices, it actually changes our brain topography, for that matter. Our brain starts to grow in new areas. Hardships, we've all had them, and the rigors of my studies, departmental changes, the rigors of life itself, at times can be very, very demanding on us. And it was because of these practices that I was able to work through them and actually develop my own life around them and not be as disturbed as I would have been in the past. The core of what I had learned is that the energy of the mind is the essence of life. So this is what led me on that journey toward really working with the mind field itself. We need to be able to restore ourselves to a place of clarity and resilience, where we're able to rise above the complications and troubles that can affect our lives. And this is so important right now. It's especially true. There are 2 skills that you need to rise above the chaos to master your own life. One is to have the awareness to recognize the root of the problem that you're having and knowledge to understand the problem in its entirety. In most cases, the problem lies in the mind itself, a mind that's been scattered, beaten, even insulted. Because such a mind leaks energy, we create problems for ourselves. In other words, we have created through our interactions and through what has been going on in the outside world, because we've had our energy focusing there, our mind is unable to hold its energy together. And what happens is the energy of the mind becomes dissipated. And then we don't have it to utilize and live our life's purpose. This energy loss manifests itself in chemical changes in the brain. And we can see that with our neurotransmitters. So we suffer from anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, anger, animosity. All of these things are a result of an untrained mind. Most problems never exist where they appear to exist. And I've always used the example with many of you and with our community in general. Think of poison ivy. If you've ever looked at poison ivy and how it grows, they're vines, and they grow on the ground. And I remember first going to a new place where I moved in, where I found poison ivy on the lawn, and I was wondering, gee, how does poison ivy grow on the lawn? And when I started to pick it up, I noticed that it had started probably a good 100 to 200 yards away, which was very eye-opening to me to say, wow, these vines really infiltrate even the lawn. And that's the way our mind works. That's what I started to put two and two together. And so we'll find the leaf in your grass, and when you attempt to pull it out, you'll find a vine with an origin that's many feet away. Weeds work that way, even if we're weeding up a garden. Well, the mind has the same kind of what do I really want to say here? The mind has the same tendencies. It's the nature of the mind to operate the same way. When we have problems, they infiltrate beneath the surface of our mind. And when you go to pull them up, or when you try to analyze or look at what's really going on, where with weeds we see a long root chain, well, with our problems, they're also rooted farther away than where we think. And again, problems mirror the same scenario that I'm giving you. When we have a problem, we think it's simple issue like not having our favorite food for dinner, or we're upset because something happened at work, or somebody might have said something to us, or we might have even heard something that someone didn't even say because we've interpreted it based on our own issues, our own rooted issues that are deep within ourselves. And they can stem from childhood to adulthood, anywhere. But these roots need to be recognized, and we need the awareness to recognize where these roots have started so that we could just pull them up. We can weed our garden. Weeding the garden of our mind gives us that freedom and flexibility to live a happy and peaceful life. The second point that I'd like to make with a point to rise above the burnout factor is, once we decide or we have the awareness of that root, then we want to restore that which has been depleted from the problem that existed. So if we're constantly in a state of, let's say, turmoil, well, there's going to be a problem that's manifested in the body. We may have liver issues, we may have bowel issues, we may have circulatory issues, hormonal issues. We need to restore that which has been depleted from the problem that existed. And this requires the knowledge and the practices to nourish our organism back to health. One of the most profound practices is working with the breath. I didn't make this up. This has been told to me over decades and decades of my own training. Breath can restore our physical and psychological function. And I heard it once said, if you master your breath, you master your health. And this is actually true. Since the breath is the controlling factor that regulates our nervous system, without it we die, with it we exist. When it is regulated and trained, we flourish because the function of our brain is strengthened. So how do we know burnout exists? Science tells us that our brain gets affected under stress. There are two skills that we need to rise above the chaos to master our own life. And again, have the awareness to recognize the root of the problem and the knowledge to understand the problem in its entirety. And the second is to restore that which has been depleted. I'm just repeating what I already said. So we want to have the awareness, self-awareness, and then the ability to restore. There are 4 facts to consider because we know science tells us that our brain gets affected under stress. 1, your brain can change. Neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to form and reorganize synaptic connections. They're the connections between our neurons that speak to each other to send a message through the nervous system. And this occurs especially in response to learning or experiencing something or even following an injury. These changes can be self-directed with lifestyle habits. So what I'm saying here, when we adjust our lifestyle habits, that means our thinking habits, how we think, our brain will change. Scientists also say that this change is measurable, and they measure it with what we call EEG or fMRI scans. And these scans actually tell scientists what's going on with our brain, because they can see in certain circumstances that different parts of the brain will light up under these scans, or they won't show any activity. And that's how they determine this. And another fact is our thoughts and feelings create new pathways from the subcortical region of the brain, which is our limbic system, that's our emotional center, our fight and flight center, to what we call the CEO of the brain, which is our prefrontal cortex. For example, when we practice focused awareness, our reactive brain quiets and our responding brain steps up to the plate. We call this operating from the top down as opposed from the bottom up. When we operate from the bottom up, we're operating on our network that's in that fight or flight emotional state. When we operate from the top down, we're responding, we're not reacting, and we're able to change the way we respond or behave in a certain situation. And this, again, is translated into the body itself, because anything that goes on in the brain will be reflected in the body. In fact, anything that goes on in the mind is reflected in the brain and then is also reflected in the body. The fourth step to consider, or fact to consider, for restoring our brain to vital health, it requires practice. Our brain changes with continual practice. You would never expect to learn to play a new instrument without practice. Changing the happenings in our brain require consistent and systematic training. That's why it's not enough to just talk about meditating or being mindful. We must practice it. Neuroimaging studies reveal the metabolic changes in regions of the brain where activity increases or decreases in response to emotion or sensory input. As I mentioned, these kinds of scans that they do, they actually identify the metabolic changes in the regions of the brain. Well, we also see that there are specific and reproducible patterns of changing neural activity and brain structures associated with stress. So that's how we know stress leads to burnout. For example, in high stress state, we find that subjects that are doing these scans, they reveal less activity in the higher reflective brain, that's in the CEO portion of the brain, and more activity in the lower or reactive brain, which we call the emotional brain. Prolonged stress correlates with structural increases in the density and speed of neuron-to-neuron connections in that emotional part of the brain. So the brain networks that are very reactive get very heightened. And we'll have also, under stress, decreased connections in the prefrontal cortex. That's where I said was the CEO of the brain. You know, the explanations of these changes is generally attributed to the brain's neuroplasticity. And there's a saying, neurons that fire together wire together, because the brain literally rewires to be more efficient in conducting information through the circuits that are more frequently activated. So if you're continually under stress, you're going to really strengthen those neural networks that connect to the emotional reactive part of the brain rather than the responding part of the brain. As we internalize our efforts to achieve our goals and interpret them as personal failure, that happens a lot when we're at work and something might not work out the way we wanted to. We think of that as personal failure. We create self-doubt and stress, and that activates and strengthens the brain's reactive networks. As these circuits become the automatic to-go networks, because we've strengthened them so much, the brain is less successful in problem solving and emotional control. And when we have problems that arise that were previously not really a problem, we find that we're a little bit more sensitive when we're overstimulated in the limbic lower part of that brain, where we have more emotions happening and our prefrontal cortex goes offline, if you will, and we're not able to have the resilience that we've had in the past. I mentioned recognize and restore ourselves, and we have to look at the science. How do we restore this problem that we've just seen within our own neural networks? I thought, how am I going to suggest a restorative practice on this podcast when there are so many to choose? I went to the scientific literature to see where I could support the practices that I received early on. I like to back everything with science so that there's a validation for everyone to listen and to understand where things are coming from. Breath stood out loud and clear to me. Breath is the key to life and living. We've learned that in the science of yoga and through the masters that I've had exposure to early on in life. Breath is the key. It's the only autonomic function that we have conscious control over, and breath regulates the connection between the mind and the body. And that happens via the vagus nerve. There's a nerve in our body called the vagus nerve, which means wandering nerve, and it's extensive. It originates in our brainstem, the brainstem in the medulla. That's where our respiratory rate is regulated, and it goes all the way down to the abdominal region. When we focus on regulating breath, we stimulate this nerve and activate the relaxation response. In the Journal of Neuroscience in 2016, there was a study done, and they showed that breath clearly supports what the ancient masters have been saying, and they say breathing modulates brain activity and mental function. According to this study, it was suggested that the rhythm of breathing coordinates the electrical activity across the network of brain regions associated with smell, memory, emotions, and actually can enhance their functioning. This suggests that breathing is involved in orchestrating complex behaviors that we experience. Other findings indicated that the breath modulates emotional recognition and memory recall, with both processing more accurate, with processes that become more accurate during breathing and compared to breathing out. So breathing in, they actually went to that detail, finding that breathing in helped with more emotional recognition than breathing out. And that showed that the route of breathing was especially important because the effects were seen when participants were asked to breathe through their noses. Very interesting. I've had students ask me, can I breathe through my mouth? Is it the same? And I always suggest breathe through your nose because your nose is so connected neurologically that it will stimulate brain centers where your mouth will not. Something that I have taught for many years. We know that breathing is controlled unconsciously by the brainstem, and humans are the only species that are able to alter their breathing pattern in response to emotional stimuli and mental effort. So we could actually make a mental effort and say, I'm going to hold my breath, for example, or I'm going to breathe out a 2-to-1 breath. I exhale for twice as long as I breathe in. We could make those efforts and decisions where the animal in the animal kingdom are not able to do that. Our thoughts and emotions do indeed affect our breathing habit. Engaging in learning to regulate our breath is very, very important. I would suggest start on a counting practice for yourself. I just mentioned a 2-to-1 breath. You don't have to necessarily exhale for twice as long as inhale, but work toward that. So you want to practice for 5 minutes a day, inhaling and exhaling. And when you exhale, try to lengthen that exhale. It's great if you can do it twice as long as the inhale. So in other words, if you inhale for 3, exhale for 6, and do it during a 5-minute practice daily. Learn to elongate the exhalation. When we practice 5 minutes a day, set a timer, practice 5 minutes a day. You will find a benefit over the course of 3 to 5 days. You will start seeing quite a change in your reactive brain. It will become more of a responsive brain. So you'll respond rather than having the same reactions. So I call that a 2-to-1 breath. So in summary, the brain can change. This change is measurable and our thinking affects it. We can address the burnout problem in 2 ways: recognizing the root of the problem and then restoring what is lost. And here we talked about through the practice of breath. Although there are many others, there's herbs, there's diet, many others that we incorporate, but for this purpose we spoke about the breath. Breath awareness is one tool that can accomplish both the awareness as well as the restoration of burnout. Why is this important? Because it translates into the body. In order to cultivate the life that I want, I need to cultivate the mind. And we can cultivate a clear and resilient mind with practice. Practice on what? Ultimately, we start with breath, but ultimately we want to learn how to meditate. Meditation starts with the breath. You cannot meditate if you don't have mastery over your breath. So when we go into a quick fix, let's just sit and be mindful, we really need to start with the breath, because the breath is the key connecting the mind and the body. Without it, the mind and body are disjointed. Meditation practice delivers some benefits to the brain as well as your life. It actually trains the brain through the mind, working with the mind. We know that the brain is what we call plastic, that different parts grow and shrink depending on what we feed our mind through our thoughts, feelings, and actions. And meditation grows areas in emotion and self-control and resilience. 3 things that enhance our comfort and well-being. Whatever else we want to do, whether we want to play a sport, hike, play an instrument, you'll want to have an agile mind. And you want the awareness of your whole being. And that's necessary to perform with enjoyment and skill. Health is awareness that flows through every part of the mind-body complex. And flexibility of the mind is reflected even in our blood vessels. For example, our thoughts are reflected in our blood vessels. A flexible mind indicates a relaxed being. When we're relaxed, our blood vessels dilate, allowing the blood to flow freely throughout the entire body and brain. Keeping our mind energetic while relaxed is the essence of being happy, healthy, and in harmony. Always remember that the energy of your mind is the essence of life. This brings us to the end of this episode. If you'd like to be notified weekly for new podcasts, please subscribe. The Susan Taylor Podcast is available on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and TuneIn. Also on susantaylor.org, where you can click on the podcast to subscribe. And if you like it, give us a rating. We'd love to hear from you and see how you're enjoying our content. Thank you for listening. Susan Taylor Podcast does come out every week. And again, questions, comments, something you might want to hear, like today's topic was something that you wanted to hear on burnout. Contact us at susantaylor.org. And until next time, remain calm.